I worked before Taliban taking over and during and after Taliban taking over.
He's obviously feeling something very deeply.
Some people have chosen to cryogenically freeze their pets.
And so that can be a really hard experience.
Welcome to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. I'm Allan Dowthwaite. I normally sit on the other side of the mixing console, but in celebration of our 500th episode, I'm taking over. Maybe I'm a bit delusional, but I thought you wouldn't mind, just this once, listening to some of my favourite moments from the last 12 and a half years of amazing conversations. If not, that's okay, normal service will resume next week. It hasn't been easy choosing what to include here while still keeping the episode to a reasonable length, so lots of good stuff has ended up on the cutting room floor. The snippets that have made it are all here for particular reasons, and I'll explain some of my choices along the way. Hopefully, there'll be a few that will prompt you to dive into our back catalogue and listen to the full episodes. So, let's get started. From the beginning, Life and Faith has sought to understand our culture, 21st century Western culture that is. Why do we think and behave the way we do? What can we be glad about and celebrate in modern society? And what might need a discerning critique? So that's where we're going to start, examining the cultural waters in which we swim. And we're going to start from the very beginning, 2012, the first year of Life and Faith. And veteran journalist Ross Gittins. I pretty much learned everything I know about economics from Ross. After him, we'll hear political scientist Dale Keane, whose assessment 12 years ago of where what he called the I world was heading was surprisingly prescient. Then we'll jump forward a few years to film critic Alyssa Wilkinson talking about zombies. And finally, Andy Crouch on one of the unexpected side effects of adopting technology. Here's Simon Smart with Ross Gittins to kick us off.
I'm honoured today to have as a guest Fairfax journalist and author, the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Ross Gittins. Welcome, Ross.
G'day, Simon.
It's good to have you in. Now, Ross, you've written for decades about economic matters, and especially in recent years, some of the themes that have come out of your writing I'd like to explore. And the first of these is the concept of happiness. You've done some thinking around this. I know you appeared at the Happiness Conference in Sydney. But when you talk about being happy, you mean something more substantial than just feeling good all the time, right?
I certainly do, yes. And I think that's very important. I think if you have a very narrow definition of happiness, which is seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, there's no great virtue in that. That's really just hedonism. And I don't think that puts any meaning in your life. It wouldn't leave you with thinking that you'd had a very satisfied life, which I think is part of what you're trying to achieve with your life. But I also think that there are a lot of things that the people who study happiness and the positive psychologists have come up with, which have a very strong Christian resonance, probably also resonance with other religions, but certainly with Christianity. And one of the things that seems clear, if you're writing a book about happiness and you're giving people tips on how to be happy, as I have done, one of the biggest tips is don't focus on your own happiness, focus on the happiness of other people. If you sit there taking your happiness temperature every 10 minutes, am I happy, you won't be happy. But if you throw yourself into making other people happy, then often in reflection, you'll say, well, I'm actually having a good time here. So this is satisfying.
Right?
Yes.
It's a byproduct of that.
Happiness is something that you don't go for directly. It's achieved indirectly, and it's often achieved when you stop thinking about it and you start thinking about other things.
Would you say that the history of the West in some ways has been a discarding of the reference points that, once formally defined us? So, we no longer want to be anchored in some sense. We want to be on the move constantly, not really tied down to any one particular ideology or belief or religion. We want movement, and yet what are we giving up at the same time?
I mean, I think we're giving up security to get freedom. We're giving up definition in order to get opportunity. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, does the I world end in a coherent place that is good for people? And my suspicion is that the I world will not deliver what it promises.
In your book, you talk about the 3 taboos that govern our behaviour today. So firstly, that I'm allowed to do whatever I want so long as I don't hurt anyone. And then secondly, this idea that whatever I do with someone else must be governed by consent. And thirdly, you can't judge other people. The 3 taboos in some ways, does it lead to an impoverishment of public debate and the things that you can talk about because you just know that you'll be driven apart by your differences?
Oh, I completely agree with that. I think that we're losing public debate. We're losing civil debate. You can't have a democracy if we can't talk to each other. We're in a situation where if you want to talk about some issues of great importance, but issues that are personally important to people, if you bring up certain alternatives, you're going to be shouted down without even a hearing. That's not democracy.
Alyssa Wilkinson is a film critic and the author of How to Survive the Apocalypse. And it does feel like there's no escape from the zombies, dystopian futures and apocalypses that will certainly bring about our end. So why are we obsessed with this narrative?
Well, one big reason is that stories of apocalypse and post-apocalypse are basically as old as the hills. We just have a very particular bent on it in the 20th and 21st century, which is that the apocalypse isn't something visited on us by God or the gods, but that we're going to bring it on ourselves through science or technology or all these different ways that we might bring the apocalypse on. And so when we see that turn towards dystopia, I think what we're seeing is the optimism of the Enlightenment, the idea that we could create a utopia on Earth. That has proven to be false. These systems that we came up with to bring about a utopia have failed, and we see that all throughout the 20th century. So dystopia is sort of it's where we look at it and say, oh, utopia was only utopia for whoever created the utopia. Dystopia, though, is a pessimistic version of the future. And it's where we're kind of working out our biggest anxieties as a culture. Like, for instance, does the human race deserve to continue? Or would it be better if we just went away, right? Or how, if all the niceties of civilization were stripped away from us, how would we treat one another? What kind of a society would we come up with? What's left at the end? And so if we think about Hunger Games, for instance, it's about an authoritarian regime that pits teenagers against each other to fight to the death. But really, it's about a culture soaked in entertainment that's too distracted to notice that it's been taken over by tyrants. And the conclusion of the book is that someone in power will always be seeking their own good, but all we really have is each other. And that's the conclusion. And that's, I think, a conclusion that a lot of people are coming up with, that human relationships is where the only lasting good can be found. And this is sad in some ways because it leaves out things like good institutions. But it's also good to see that people are coming to that conclusion because that's a place that we can really start from if we're wanting to build a more just society.
The great promise of technology is we will no longer have to do X.
Yeah.
Wash my clothes by hand or build a fire every night to stay warm, whatever it is. We'll now be able to do Y and move easily from town to town. We can drive, we can fly, all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
These are huge gifts to us. And yet, these advances that we don't want to be without do kind of lose their luster quite quickly, don't they?
Interesting. In many cases, yes. Maybe not all. But I think it relates to the fact that we adopt technology for basically 2 reasons. One is expanded capabilities, and the other is relieved burdens. That's what you said. Well, I'll no longer have to do this tedious thing, and I'll be able to do this amazing thing that I couldn't do before. But there's 2 other shadow promises, you could say, that come with every adoption of every single thing human beings have ever used as a tool or instrument or device. Yes, you'll be able to do this thing, but you'll no longer be able to do this other thing.
Yeah.
And the other is, yes, you'll no longer have to do this thing, but now you will have to do this thing. I mean, for example, if I had to make a fire every night, I'd be in trouble in some ways. Like, I do know how to build a fire, but I live in a society that's made it, impossible to build a fire every night. Even though my ancestors in my part of America, which is a cold part of the country, every winter they would do that routinely. But now it is that I lack certain abilities. So part of why we find this disillusionment on the other side of the adoption of new tech It's not that the thing has stopped working or delivering the reason we bought it. It's that we didn't reckon with the diminishment of our lives, which is sometimes very hard to spot. So now that I have a furnace in my basement and I just set the thermometer, I mean, in a way that seems so lovely. Like, oh, I just tell it I want it to be so many degrees and it does it. I don't even know how it does it. What I don't maybe reckon with is all that I've lost, which you'd rediscover if you actually go out, to gather the wood, to split the wood, to stack the wood, to bring it in, to light the fire, to sit by the fire. There's all these joys, actually. They have a kind of fulfillment that setting the thermostat doesn't. And I no longer can do a lot of that. Like, it's just no longer available to me.
I've got one more clip in this section. In 2018, we were very excited to get Tim Winton into the studio to discuss his then latest book, The Shepherd's Hut. Tim is a very deep thinker, and the conversation went in some surprising directions, including to the problem of what we now call toxic masculinity. I've chosen this next clip for two reasons. First, it's a topic that I feel quite passionate about, and 6 years on from this interview, we don't seem to have made much headway. But also because Tim is just awesome, and it gives me a chance to plug CPX's annual lecture that he'll be delivering later this year. See the show notes for a link to get tickets. Here's Tim.
I'm interested in the way that men are blind to how rotten patriarchy and misogyny is for them as well, because it distorts their lives, it narrows them. And we see that right from childhood. You watch these lovely, tender, vulnerable, graceful boys having all those lovely qualities, which are natural qualities in boys as much as in girls, having it shamed or beaten out of them so that they cleave to one very narrow view of masculinity, which is hard, narrow, silent, angry, and taking, never giving. But you don't realise that just impoverishes kids, it impoverishes boys, it impoverishes their manhood, and it impoverishes everybody and endangers everybody else around them. And it's not necessary, And look, I think the church has quite a bit to answer for in this regard. We're great, over the centuries, great supporters of patriarchy, and it's always men who've benefited, and I think it's great that women have made such strides in the last couple of generations, but they're motivated to progress because there's something to get, and they see that there's something to get. If you're going to try and get equity and you're going to get justice and you're going to get some sort of equality of power, you reach for that, but you're motivated to do that. Where we're stuck is the other side of the equation, and where the real progress can be made from here is men changing. But there's a difference of motivation, because to change and progress, men need to not reach out so much as to let go and relent, and to examine themselves, and to become conscious of all their unexamined privilege, the ways in which they project violence and control when they're not even conscious of it. And until men are prepared to examine themselves and climb down off their roosts, then I think the prospects for all of us aren't so good. Women can only fight so hard and so far, and it's great that they are, that you move forward, you plant your flag, you defend your position, you send a few brave people out to ahead, and you gain a little bit more ground. It just doesn't need to be like that. If men could own up, wise up, and be decent.
A regular focus of Life and Faith is how Christianity explains our world and us. Natasha's conversation with cold case detective Jim Wallace was particularly memorable for me. Who doesn't like a good true crime story? And then I'm going to play you a clip from Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Marilyn Robinson. I really have met some amazing people on this journey. And then Francis Spufford, the author of the most brilliantly titled book, Unapologetic: Why, Despite Everything, Christianity Can Still Make Surprising Emotional Sense. Here's Natasha with Jim.
Worldviews basically answer three important questions. How did we get here? Why is it so messed up? And how do we fix it? And your worldview is going to have some description of human nature. I work cold cases. These are the cases that went unsolved for 30 years. I don't work serial killers. Those are different kinds of cases. When you knock on the door of the neighbor of a serial killer that you're now taking to jail, that neighbor is likely to say, oh, I'm so glad you're taking that guy to jail. That guy's crazy. I mean, it smells bad over there all the time. There's all kinds of weird noises over there. He's a weirdo to begin with, and he's always digging holes in his backyard. I'm not quite sure what to make of all that, right? But then when you take someone to jail for my kinds of cases, where a guy did a murder 30 years ago and got away with it, and you knock on the neighbor's door and tell him, yeah, I'm taking your neighbor to jail for this case from 30 years ago, they'll typically say, that, oh, there's no way. There's no way that guy could. No, I've known that guy for 30 years. He's a great guy. And that's because this guy's a killer, but he only did one murder. He did one murder 30 years ago, and he's basically lived like everybody else ever since. And that's how he got away with it. Now, granted, one's enough to make you a killer.
Yeah.
But in essence, he's displayed the character that all the rest of us have displayed over the last 30 years. He's your banker. He's your neighbor. He's your teacher. He's your professor. He's your deacon in your church. I mean, these are guys and gals that, for the most part, look just like everybody else. And so your whatever your worldview is that describes humans, you got to make room in it for this description of humans. And not every worldview does a good job of that. But once it does, then you'll see yourself differently too. Because the truth of it is that, but for the grace of God, every single one of us is that same killer. It just hasn't been provoked to the point of actually committing the crime.
Now, your writing, your fiction writing for sure, deeply reflects that sort of value of the human person. Although it's very much within that framework of understanding our failures and our flaws, isn't it?
We have to deal with the fact that we are flawed and that we are all flawed. I think that the idea of original sin is one of the most brilliant that antiquity has yielded. People want to set themselves apart from the evil that has existed in the world and exists now, the sadness, all of it. But that makes them hard, I think, because they act as if it were all some terrible error made by other people that they themselves are not vulnerable to making. And I think real humanism depends on taking the whole history of humankind, which is really really a difficult thing. But at the same time, we have to look with pity and we have to look with recognition on all the generations that have come before us and understand that we are as blind as they are.
What is the most emotionally appealing aspect of Christianity in your mind?
I'm an old-fashioned believer in sin in some ways. And I think, although it's not the fashionable place to start, I think it tells us the bad news about ourselves in a coherent and useful and kind of relieving sort of way. The first bit of emotional sense that Christianity made to me, and I think it's a useful starting point, is that it takes your destructive impulses seriously. It provides you with an escape hatch from that rather unconvincing all sunshine all the time account of human behaviour, which is demonstrably not true and leaves you stuffed when you're trying to account for bits of your own behaviour which don't fit the model.
Even that thought is one that modern people want to resist. Why do you think people are so reluctant to face the sort of the darkness of our world and our own darkness?
Because we have a hysterically anxious sense that unless we're admirable, we're nothing. I think there is a terrible anxiety in contemporary culture about being fallible or vulnerable or wrong about stuff. And that unless you've tried the daring experiment of saying you're in the wrong, you're not quite sure it's survivable necessarily. You think that, kind of the battlements will fall, the walls will collapse, the castle of yourself will implode, and there may be nothing left but a stain on the pavement, which is not the case. In fact, a fallible self can be a kind of well-founded self, a self which has room for failure and therefore kind of room for much more as well. But it's hard to know in advance that taking off the mask of virtue will leave you with a perfectly acceptable face underneath.
I couldn't finish this section without including the amazing Tom Holland. Not the amazing Spider-Man Tom Holland, but the amazing host of the Rest is History podcast, Tom Holland. It would be hard to find a more succinct statement on Christianity's impact on the world than the one he gave Simon.
I think the easiest way to explain that is actually to look at the symbol that lies at the heart of Christianity, which of course is the cross. Now, to the Romans, the cross also was a symbol, and it was a symbol of power. If you've seen Spartacus, you'll remember the slaves get crucified along the line of the Appian Way, and they are there to serve as kind of human billboards advertising Roman power, and specifically the right of Rome to torture to death those who rebel against Roman power, and specifically to torture to death slaves who rebel against their masters. And the cross is regarded as the absolutely archetypal form of death to inflict on a slave, because it combines excruciating physical pain with public humiliation. And the Roman world is a world in which humiliation is almost, in many cases, worse than death. So you're nailed to a cross. People can see as birds peck out your eyes or attack your genitals, or as you strain and gasp and sob and moan. It's all public. What Christianity does is to turn that on its head and to say that actually the cross symbolizes the power of the weak over the strong, of the slave over the master, of the powerless over the powerful, and subverts it so profoundly that today the cross, not just within the Christian world, but across the entire globe, is probably the most instantly recognizable symbol that humanity has ever devised. And it is not a symbol of torture, it's a symbol of hope. You don't need to be a believing Christian. If you are injured and you see someone come to you with a red cross on a van, you know that's good. If you'd been a Roman and you saw someone coming to you with a cross, that would be bad news. And I think that completely sums up the arc of the revolution.
Sometimes what makes an episode stand out for me is simply a great story or a great personality. The next clip allows me to kill two birds with one stone. Mathematician John Lennox is one of my favourite people on the planet. I've had the good fortune to spend a bit of time with John over the years, and I could never get tired of listening to him. Another Northern Irishman who I admire is C.S. Lewis. Now, obviously, I've never met him because he died before I was born, but John was at Cambridge while Lewis was there, and his description of hearing some of Lewis's last lectures is delightful.
The university authorities persuaded him to give a lecture in the Michaelmas term 1962, and the lecture rooms where he was speaking were just across the road from the mathematics department. I found out when they were, and I'm afraid I skipped a few maths lectures just to cross the road surreptitiously and join the vast throng of people sitting in the windows and on the floor and everywhere else listening to Lewis. There was no health and safety rule in those days. It was a very, very cold winter, and he was a big burly chap. The lecture hall had double doors, and at the exact second of the start, he would burst in through the double doors, complete with his coat and hat and scarf, and he would just start lecturing. Carefully picking his way among the students sitting on the floor, he would lecture and increase in volume as he took off his various garments. He'd take off his hat, unwind his scarf, take off his coat, and all that was completed just as he reached the podium. So by that time, you'd already had 2 or 3 minutes of an absolutely brilliantly worded lecture. But it was so amusing because he lectured, I think, for exactly 50 minutes. And then he reversed this process. He kept lecturing as he put on his hat, coat, wound up the scarf, picked his way through the students, and the last words were uttered as he burst out of the double doors. There was no time for Q&A.
I've always wanted to go to Antarctica. I doubt I'll ever get there. But Alex Gaffican lived there for 2 years, and listening to her joy at the wonder of the creation around her might just be the next best thing.
We would travel down to the coast, the edge of the Brunt Ice Shelf. So we were living on a glacier, essentially. We would camp by the edge of the glacier and sometimes abseil or walk down to the sea ice. And we'd visit the emperor penguin colony, which lived near us. And that was tremendous. I mean, there were sort of thousands of birds. They're all sort of huddled together, keeping warm. It was nice as well because it felt like you were back in a crowd because I missed crowds. There was only 16 of us. So it was just like we were a bit bored of each other. So it was great to meet new people, even though they were penguins.
You've spoken about getting woken up in the middle of the night by the person who was on watch and being told to come outside and look at the southern lights?
The Aurora Australis, we'd get most dramatic light shows. And sometimes it would just be a sort of dull green kind of colour on the edge of the horizon. But sometimes you go outside and it was just going bananas. There would be whites, pinks, greens, sort of floaty kind of things, sort of, it's totally silent, but just this amazing sort of vivid light show for you. Wonderful, really.
Does it get quite, I guess, spiritual? And you're already a person of belief, but do people's thoughts kind of stray upward at that point and start thinking about the bigger questions, I suppose?
Oh, definitely. And I'd be walking back between buildings and I would just stop and look up and you just felt tiny, looking at this immense galaxy of stars, and you felt it sort of almost vertiginous, that you could fall into space, and sort of is an immensity that I suppose that makes you feel quite small, but also lucky that you can stand there and just look out over this gorgeous view. And I used to imagine that, on other planets, there are some other alien versions of Alex looking back at me and, imagine what's out there, where am I in my world?
It's not every day you meet a real live Scotsman named Johnny Walker. But earlier this year we did, during an episode we made on the Camino Santiago, an ancient and very long pilgrimage walk through France and Spain. Johnny was a real character. And if I could choose my grandfather, it'd be Johnny.
I'm a church organist, so I'm in church more often than more priests and ministers, and yet being able to say the creed with utter conviction has always escaped me. I've always wanted to say, I might believe in one God, the Father Almighty, or I'd like to believe in one God, the Father Almighty, or I'll try to. And I made great efforts, but walking the Camino over all these years has taught me, John, stop trying. Be there in the moment, think of the Lord, say your prayers, think of other people, and stop the debating. And this has been so good for me and has given me a spiritual life that I never ever thought I would have. I thought I would die still having the great debate.
Sometimes what you're expecting to get when you go into an interview is nothing like what you actually get. In 2017, Simon and I were in the US filming for our documentary For the Love of God. While speaking to Princeton scholar Albert Roberto about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, what was an excellent but fairly straightforward interview about history suddenly took a very personal turn. I'll never forget this.
My father was killed by a white man in Mississippi 3 months before I was born, and the white man who killed him was never tried. He claimed self-defense, and he wasn't indicted even. And when I was growing up, I knew that my father was dead. My mother and stepfather raised me. But they didn't talk about the circumstance of my father's death. I didn't indeed find out much about it until I went back to Mississippi when I was 50 years old to investigate. And when I was 17 and getting ready to go off to college, they sat me down and for the first time explained to me what had happened. And they said, the reason we didn't tell you before this was we didn't want you to grow up hating white people. Now, I had two responses to that. One was I was glad that they told me. The second response was, what kind of country is it that we live in when you can't tell a child why his father was killed because you didn't want him to grow up hating white people?
It was because of this, because his father was killed, that his mother moved the family from the South to the Midwest. And it took him quite a while before he returned to Mississippi to find out what really happened.
When I went back when I was 50, I talked to some of my relatives about it. And I went to the police department and found the record of the murder of my father. And one of the policemen said that he had heard that the son of the man who had murdered my father lived in a close by town. So I found his name in the phone book and I called him up and I said, I'm the son of Albert Roberto, whom your father killed, and I'd like to know what your family's version of that story is. And he said, oh, yes. He paused a minute and he said, yes, I was 9 years old when that happened, so I remember your father. And I remember him as a big burly man, and he and my father fought, and my father pulled a gun in self-defense and shot him. Well, I have a picture of my father standing between my two sisters. One was 11, one was 13. He's barely taller than my 11-year-old sister. His build was like mine. He was very slender. And so he was not a burly man. So I didn't challenge him about that. But I did say, what happened to your father? He said, he came down with terminal cancer and he shot and killed himself. And I was very tempted to say, did he use the same gun as he did when he shot my father? But I thought that would have been cruel, so I didn't.
Roberto didn't get angry. He didn't hate the man who killed his father. And he told me that because he didn't know about how his father died, his mother actually succeeded in raising him as a man who didn't hate white people. But he did carry a particularly painful scar from this. He didn't have a sense of who his father was.
After that conversation, I visited my father's grave, and I had been there many times over the years. But for the first time, I began to cry. It was as if, in my mind's eye, I saw him. I saw him getting shot, and I saw him falling, and it was as if he was falling into my arms and into my life, and it was as if a father and son had finally met.
We've tried hard to ensure that we hear the voices of First Nations people on Life and Faith, their history and their experiences. In 2013, an old friend, Matt Andrews, opened my eyes to the incredible legacy of a Yorta Yorta man named William Cooper in laying the foundations back in the 1930s for Indigenous rights. You'll hear one small part of that story. Then, Torres Strait Islander Gabrielle Barney tells Simon about facing racism. And finally, Auntie Maureen, sitting in her lounge room in Cummeragunja, talks about her experience as a member of the Stolen Generations.
Now, let's trace the link here, because I want to talk about Crystal Night, November 9th and 10th of 1938, where Jewish businesses and homes, synagogues were attacked, smashed up, many people killed. And about a month later in Melbourne, there was a protest against this action that was launched, and this is where William Cooper comes into it. What did Cooper do, Matt?
Cooper led a delegation of the Australian Aborigines League. Now, he'd done that before. On this day, in December 1938, they went on a march from Ballarat Road in Footscray all the way to 415 Collins Street to make protest against a government agency for their policies. But
So they go to the German Consul General.
It's the Reichskonsulate to have a meeting with Dr. Dreschler. So the absurdities of this are extraordinary. Yad Vashem, which is the preeminent Holocaust research centre in the world, says it's the only protest of its kind anywhere. It wasn't English people in London, it wasn't, French Jews in Paris, it wasn't American Jews in New York. It was Aboriginal Australians in Melbourne who weren't even citizens of their own country.
What sort of reaction did William Cooper get to the protest?
Well, he was reported the very next day. I think it's in the Argus, you can look it up. In one sense, you'd have to think that several of their members at the time would have thought it a complete failure. What we do know is this. Earlier in the year, in 1938, Australia sent a delegation to the Evian conference on the shoreline of Lake Geneva to work out what we were going to do, what was the world going to do, especially Western powers going to do, with refugees, that being the Jews of Europe who were pouring out of Austria and Germany. The delegation that Australia sent made an official statement afterwards, which was in its appalling language, but the language was, Australia does not have a racialism problem, and we don't intend to import one. A horrible thing to say, but that was the position of Australia. That was zero intake of Jews. Now, on the Thursday, following the Tuesday of the march, the Minister for the Interior, Jock McEwen, made a press announcement, which is reported in The Age the next day. And the announcement was Australia would be taking in 15,000 Jews. Somebody changed their mind. And we don't know if it was William Cooper's protest that made the difference. We do know that it was reported. We do know that it caused ripples. And we do know that Australia changed its mind. And I tell you this, we, as a per capita, took in more Jews as refugees from Europe than any other country in the world.
I want to ask you about racism and ways in which you have experienced that. Have you? And if so, in what sense?
Yes, there is, just growing up, looking for jobs, our career, all of that, aspirations and things. We've encountered a lot of that, even being part of the organizations that we worked for. There was a lot of that in there as well, how you're treated and how information comes to you, and how you're valued actually to give an input into things. Well, a few days ago, traveling down to Sydney, when we boarded the aircraft, me and my wife, so we had to go in through the back stairs here. The others went through, just depending on your seat, your row. And there was this big line, and we were the only Indigenous or Islander people walking, and there were all these Europeans. And one of the flight attendants, they were standing at the bottom of the steps and saying hello to everybody. And then when we walked past her, she stopped us and wanted to have a look at our tickets. And then we showed them, oh, okay, you're okay, then you can go. Then I stopped and I turned. If she was going to do that to anybody else, it was only to us. And I said, oh, is it the color of our skin? Why are you not stopping anybody else checking their tickets, It's just there, and I think people are not aware.
At that moment, what does that make you feel like?
Well, that anger, I was angry, and my wife said, no, just leave it. Like I was just going to say, I was going to start a whole big thing there, but then I decided, no, just walk away. But a lot of anger. But then after settling down as we were entering the aircraft, I just began to understand again that this is where we are at our point, this country, people, a long way to go. But also, that's where we need to begin, as well, that individual, personal connection is really important. With families and people, houses, neighborhoods,
I'm of the stolen generation. When I was 8 years old, we were taken away from our parents. There was 8 of us in the family. The 2 eldest boys went together to a home in Adelaide. The 3 youngest boys went to another home in Adelaide. And my 2 sisters were taken to a foster home in Adelaide together. So they were all together, and I was left at Amiwara Mission in Port Augusta, South Australia.
Auntie Maureen points to a painting behind her. It's covered in bubble wrap. She says it tells her story. So we take off the bubble wrap, and it's this beautiful canvas of earthy colours with dark circles scattered across it. They're connected, though, by a trail of white dots. I ask her to explain it to me, and she says it's called loss and separation.
When I started talking my language, the other kid said, who do you think you are? You're white. You're not black. And that's not, it was changing my identity, changing who I was. And because I'd lost so much, I'd lost my siblings, I lost my language, I lost my culture. And so, it was very, very hard.
Auntie Maureen points to a grey figure in the top right quarter of the painting.
This is me at Amiwara. I found it hard because I wasn't black, I wasn't white. So I must have been some dirty grey colour in between. And that's how I saw myself, which was sad. When my brothers and sisters were taken away, down the bottom there, that's the 2 eldest boys together, the 3 youngest boys together, and my sisters together at a foster home. They wanted the foster mother to take me as well, and she said, oh no, I can't take her. I just want the 2 pretty young ones. How did that make me feel? And we were in the mission. We weren't allowed to be inside at all. We had to play outside all day. But there were times when I needed to get away And there was one little dark spot, a little room.
She's pointing at a little black circle next to the grey figure.
And we weren't allowed inside, but I'd go there. And that's my time to mourn my family. I'd just sit there and rock backwards and forwards, just missing them so much. Yeah, it was hard being there, but it became easier for me because I had the Lord Jesus and he was always there for me.
From time to time, we ask guests to tell us about their journey to faith. What attracted them to the Christian story? What barriers did they have to overcome? What was it like when the truth, beauty and goodness of Christianity finally made sense? There are two of these stories that I particularly enjoyed. ABC Religion and Ethics editor Scott Stevens and popular children's author Susanna McFarlane, some of whose books my kids read when they were little.
There was a conversion moment for me. I mean, it really was just that. I had to self-fund a fair bit of this particular studying venture. And one of the jobs that I had was as a shop assistant at More Books. And my favorite part of the year was when they did their big stock take, when they took all those dusty old academic volumes and sort of tried to move them out of the store as quick as possible. So I remember vividly being in the back room and coming across a book called Justice, Holiness, and Politics in the Teachings of Jesus by Marcus J. Borg. And I remember, it was late at night. I ended up way overstaying my welcome there, sitting in the corner reading this book. And he was talking about the way in which Jesus, in Luke 6:36, takes these two commands of the Old Testament. On the one hand, Leviticus 17:2. You can tell that this lives with me. I think about this almost every day. Leviticus 17:2, you shall be holy, for the Lord your God is holy. That was the motto of my early life. That was drummed into us. And then he said, look at the way that Jesus takes that and combines it with Hosea 6:6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And then look what Jesus does with that. In Luke 6:36, you shall be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. And then that just began cracking things open for me. I began watching the ways as I poured back over again and again the Gospels, the way that at those very moments that you would expect Jesus to be contaminated by sin or to be affected by the uncleanness of others, Jesus isn't contaminated. Instead, his holiness rubs off on others. That was a transformative moment for me. I'd grown up terrified that the world was going to rub off. I was terrified that somehow all the institutions and structures there were going to somehow compromise what my parents firmly believed and instilled in me what God wanted me to do. And that did lead to a bit of fearfulness, not of judgment, but that I was going to screw up this vocation, that I wasn't going to be worthy of it. But at that moment, realizing that holiness's true expression is in self-giving, life-giving, outpouring, infectious mercy that doesn't get contaminated by what's out there, but transforms what's out there. That changed everything for me. It revolutionized the way that I looked at the world. I also should say, it also torpedoed my plans of a future career simply studying the Old Testament. That was what I was going to end up doing. And for me, there was a profound dissatisfaction with that. I wanted to go further afield.
Hence, we don't have to call you Old Testament Scott.
Can you imagine?
I didn't think about religion at all. So when I found out my birth mum was a Christian and a full-on Christian, and she kept talking about how God was a person and he wanted to meet me, and I was going, oh no, she's mental. I finally, 50 years on, I meet this woman and I think I'm going to have a relationship with her, and she's unhinged.
So you're going to help her see how deluded she is?
Yep.
And you set off to do what?
I did research and I thought, well, I'll prove to her that this is not real. And we all come a bit broken in life, so I'll prove that because of things that happened to her, she kind of held on to this crutch that's built on nothing. And it's all a bit embarrassing now. And I got to the bit about the resurrection, and I had, insofar as I did university at all, I did history. So I was kind of looking for kind of historical facts. And so I found myself looking at the kind of historicity of the evidence and becoming clear that there was more evidence to account for the resurrection there was from pretty much any other historical event at that time. And I was just kind of being worn down by it. And I remember I was at my desk Googling And I said a word which I won't repeat here, going, "Oh, it's true." And I remember writing in my journal that word again.
Oh, no.
And going, "I don't want to be a Christian." And I didn't. I thought Christians were terrible.
Yeah, so tell me about that. What was the gut feeling for you when you feared that this might actually have something to it?
Well, first was I thought they were mad because they were talking to an invisible, imaginary non-entity. But then I thought they were judgmental and that they abdicated responsibility. They weren't fun, and I didn't want to be one. It was terrible because I thought, how am I going to get out of this?
Yes.
So I was still kind of squirming on the hook because I don't want to be a Christian. How am I going to tell my husband? How am I going to tell my children? This is a really bad idea, but you can't unknow what you know. And that was the clincher.
Was there a point where that awful sense of this turned into something that's more positive?
Yeah, and there were some moments with hindsight you can actually see a kind of path that, and there was a friend's mum had died and we'd gone to a memorial service, and was actually at a golf course, which was more appropriate for my kind of circle of friends. But I had this sense if I wanted to go to church and take communion. And I went to this tiny little church where it was good for my self-esteem because I was the youngest and the slimmest by about 30 years and 30 kilos.
Always good, isn't that? When that
so
happens.
I thought, that would work. But it was a very kind of small, and I just took communion and I had this kind of sense of peace. But I just cast that off as a bit of kind of emotion and went on my way. I mean, it did get easier, but it was the reality of it that kind of cornered me. And I couldn't argue out of it. So I just thought, well, now what? And, of course, my birth mother was very gracious about it, actually, when I had to come back and go, you might be right.
To finish our tour through 500 episodes of Life and Faith, I'd like to share some stories from 3 people whose Christian faith motivated them to do extraordinary things. Valerie Browning is a nurse who has spent over 50 years living and working amongst some of the poorest people in Africa. She's probably the scariest person we've ever interviewed. Don't get me wrong, she is lovely, but her life is such a challenge to the comfortable middle-class world that, quite frankly, I'm quite content to occupy.
We were in the civil war of Djibouti, which is not well known about, but there was a civil war from 1992 to beginning of 96. Very bitterly fought civil war. I was trying to help those who were behind the lines and who was literally, again, I've been with so many malnourished people. These people were actually starving. They had no medicine. They had nothing. And I was walking with camel caravans all over Djibouti. The French reconnaissance fighters came in to take away any territory that the people that I was assisting had got. And so I had to run through horrible desert land with stones all everywhere for over 12 hours with my child, Aisha. She was then nearly 2 on my back to save my life with the French fighter planes overhead, the ISA army coming behind us. That was a run literally for my life, yes.
Have there been times when you've wanted that Western link or that help that people get if they're Australian rather than Ethiopian?
From the beginning I learnt I couldn't have that. When I gave birth to my daughter, who's now 28, I had a caesarean section. I was 3 hours on the operating table and they couldn't open up my clamped down uterus. The child was pronounced dead and I was dying. The death clothes were brought to wrap us up. So I knew how low I'd gone, and I knew that I couldn't expect anything. I just had to accept. And that's the way it is. I've been bitten by a snake and almost died from the snake poison. What else? Well, years ago with the Eritreans, a bullet went straight through my hair. More recently had a bit of cerebral malaria, but if I say we as Western people, we have no right over local people at all. If we take that right, it is so wrong. It is so, so wrong. So if they don't have the ability to take a helicopter out of the country and get medical help, well, I don't either. And I know I shouldn't.
Those who know me know that I love sport, and especially cricket. So it was a real treat for me when we interviewed Henry Alonga, the Zimbabwean fast bowler who, at the 2003 World Cup, along with his captain Andy Flower, took a very public stand against his country's dictator, Robert Mugabe. It's a modern-day David and Goliath story.
David, this young boy, faces a giant. Parallel that with this young cricketer who has no power but his own voice and a black armband and a piece of paper with a statement on it, facing up to a dictator who has money, wealth, the army, the police behind him. In that moment, I did feel like a David who had a cause worth fighting for and worth paying a price for. Now, did I want to lose my life over? Of course not. Was I aware of the risks? Of course I was. I was 26, so I wasn't that naive that I didn't know I was under a dictatorship that could kill me, throw me in prison, or end my career. But once again, so strong was my conviction that we saw it through. I've shared this story many times, of course, but one of the things I don't share often is the fact that my life actually got preserved because of divine intervention. Let me summarize. We did the protest. I got dropped from my cricket club. I then got booed by my own countrymen. They read horrible articles about us in the paper. So it all just came as a wave. The worst thing that happened next was I got very plausible death threats. And the one way of my preserving my life would have been if Zimbabwe progressed through to the next round of the World Cup. And the reason that would preserve my life is because those matches were being held in South Africa. And so us progressing through to the next round was absolutely key to my preservation. And if we won, we'd go through. If we got a draw, we'd go through. But a victory was unlikely. There was such a good team. They had Wazim Akram and Waka Yunus, etc. And the night before, I got on my knees and I just said a little prayer. I can't imagine it was very complicated. It was something like, God help. Long story short, we got to the ground. We started the game, 15 overs or so. Perhaps they got to 70-something runs, and then it started to drizzle. And then it got a little heavier, then they got the players off the field and put the covers on. And if we didn't get 25 overs per side, or 20 overs per side, I can't remember, it wouldn't be classified as a game. It would have to be abandoned as a draw.
You go through.
We go through.
Yeah.
And so, of course, that's what happened.
Okay.
It was very strange. It rained. We have very similar rainfall to what happens in this part of the world. So we're in the southern hemisphere as well.
Yeah.
January, February is hot and dry. Yeah. A cyclone off the coast of Mozambique, on the night I prayed, moved 800 kilometers inland, and it just managed to get enough rain on that match to rain it off. I'm not here to quantify that that was a miracle or that it was definitely divine intervention. I have no idea. But I know it saved my life. And I know that I said a wee prayer and it seemed like what needed to happen happened.
I'm going to finish with what is undoubtedly the most extraordinary interview I've ever been involved in. As a parent, I cannot comprehend the horror this couple went through, let alone their remarkable response. It was an absolute privilege to be in the studio as Danny and Layla Abdullah spoke about their decision to forgive a drunk, drug-affected driver just days after mounting a curb and killing 3 of their children.
Now, you guys have gone through the worst version of every parent's nightmare. And Danny, in addressing the driver at the sentence hearing, you described this as having your heart ripped out and run over. It's only 2 years since the incident. And I imagine the pain of that wrenching moment has not subsided completely, is it? It's probably there your whole lives.
Correct. That pain will always remain. Grief is very heavy, especially losing a child. We've lost 3 children. And it's difficult daily. People say time heals. I think time helps you manage it. You never fully heal and recover from something like this.
No, I think everyone understands that. Layla, Mum, losing your kids in that way. Tell me how that felt.
When my sister got the call from her daughter that there's something wrong with the kids, she ran and I just followed her, not knowing what to expect. I put my youngest 2 in the car and I drove to the scene. And when I got out of the car and I saw my kids the way I saw them, the last thing you think that they are dead in front of you. I was thinking positive, all is going to be good. Angelina's going to stand up. this part's going to go back. And then the ambulance came to take Liana. And when I'm in the ambulance with Liana, I kept asking him, Danny, what's going to happen to Anthony, Angelina, Sienna? And he kept saying, look, they're dead. And as a mum, I didn't believe it. I said, no, don't lose your faith. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them. Till the hospital. And Danny came in with the priest and they said to me, my kids were dead. And obviously, as a mother, I was screaming and crying and yelling and saying, no, it can't be true, can't be true.
Grief often drives people apart. You two are closer than ever?
Yeah, absolutely. Mate, Layla said something to me once. I'll never forget. She goes, how can I leave you? You look like Anthony. You remind me of Angelina. You have the qualities of Sienna. It was such a beautiful comment that you said, Layla, and I'll never forget it.
You guys were remarkably quick to offer a public forgiveness of the driver. That shocked many, many people. What does it mean to forgive something as earth-shattering as that? How's it even possible?
I recall, would have been, I think, the second day after the tragedy. Layla was on TV and she publicly forgave the driver and she said, I want the courts to be fair. It was a genuine act of forgiveness. I wasn't surprised because I know Layla.
Layla, how did you find yourself able to even say the words?
The only thing I was thinking about at that moment is the kids, Anthony, Angelina, Sienna, Veronique, Liana, Mabel and Cherbil, because there's 7 kids who were hit by the car. And I knew my kids, they were so innocent. They had a loving heart, a forgiving heart. And when I came to speak, I spoke from all my heart. And I wasn't thinking, what am I going to say or how am I going to say it? I spoke from all my heart. And forgiveness, to be honest, came natural because that's how I felt at that moment when I got asked about the driver. And it's been 2 years and yes, we have absolutely forgiven him. And when we were at the court, Liana, she looked at the driver in eyes of empathy and compassion and she goes, Mum and Dad, I actually feel sorry for the driver. I hope he doesn't get a long sentence. For us, for Liana as well, to be able to forgive, it brings peace to our hearts.
Tell me about the role, Layla, your faith plays in that.
I grew up on my faith and forgiveness has always been part of our life. Forgiveness, it's like a muscle. When you go to the gym, the more you exercise, the stronger you become, the more your muscle starts to show. And it's the same. Forgiveness, it's an act that you practice all your life. When you forgive your mom, your dad, you fight with your brother and you make up. You fight with your partner, your kids, and you make up. So it's something you practice all your life. And when you are put in a tough position, it becomes part of who you are. Forgiveness has allowed us to heal and grow together as a family. Forgiveness has given us the freedom from anger and resentment and bitterness. What I'd like to encourage people with forgiveness is don't wait for the other person. You are in control of your life and you are in control of your happiness. I didn't wait for the driver to say, I'm sorry. I got up and forgave him and freed myself from all these emotions.
You've been listening to the 500th episode of Life and Faith. Thanks for hanging in there with me as I've taken you through some of my favourite bits from the last 12 and a half years. Thanks to Simon, Justine, Natasha and Max for letting me take over this week and for their tireless work in front of the microphones on the previous 499 episodes. I will be very glad to hand it back to them next week. Thanks also to Hugh Clark, Karen Tong and Anthea Godsmark, who have all worked on Life and Faith over the years. I'm the lucky and very grateful Allan Dowthwaite. Next week, we're back to our normal format with this.
You can do more than just avoid harm or potentially even benefit society, but you may want to contribute to the solutions that are going to change our world. And we think about impact investing as the part that makes a contribution to the way that capital can help resolve some of the big problems that our society and our planet is dealing with.